October 1944. Private Joe Wheeler and thousands of his fellow American soldiers are under devastating fire from German artillery as they fight their way across Italy. It is Hitler these soldiers are trying to defeat, whose rise to power has resulted in the slaughter of millions. Private Joe Wheeler, his hands covered with blisters from digging foxholes, is trying to hang on. Half a world away, his brother John is in his own race to stop Hitler. John Wheeler is a physicist working on the Manhattan Project to develop an atomic bomb before Hitler does. They are driven by news from the front. From the battlefield, Joe sends a postcard to his older brother. The scientist understands his brother's message completely. The postcard says simply, "Hurry up."
Tonight on The Century, Ultimate Power.
Good evening, I'm Peter Jennings, and welcome again to The Century. Adolf Hitler's massive crimes against humanity stand as one of the darkest chapters in the last 100 years. What is less familiar is how Hitler acquired ultimate power. That's our first story. It's an amazing one, especially when you realize that this man who sabotaged a democracy could have been stopped. Our second story is about the race to develop man's ultimate weapon, and it is driven by the fear that Hitler might develop it first. And so, first Hitler, and then the bomb. Landsberg Prison, near Munich, Germany. In 1924, the prisoner in cell number 7 conceived of a master plan to seize absolute power in a highly advanced and democratic society. He was considered a delusional egomaniac by many, but in 10 years, he achieved his goal. In 1934, German democracy was finished. Adolf Hitler was the absolute ruler. One of his first acts was to commission this propaganda film, which played to packed houses throughout Germany for months. But triumph of the will disguised the truth. There was nothing inevitable about Hitler's rise. It was equally a triumph of luck, lies, and murder. Behind the image of the infallible dictator was a man whose triumph had been far from certain. When 18-year-old Adolf Hitler arrived in Vienna in 1907, his greatest ambition was to be accepted into the Academy of Fine Arts. A small-town teenager in the big city, he had sketched and painted watercolors, including these, for several years. He was competent, but his work did not measure up to the standards of the Academy, and twice he was turned down.
Well, he was flabbergasted. It apparently never entered his head that he would fail. And so when he did fail, he was completely taken aback by it, and that was, without question, a major setback for him, a really stinging blow to his pride. And within a couple of years, he'd slumped into the dregs of society and ended up in the flophouse for tramps and down and outs and so on. People who were really down to nothing.
An outcast and a failure, Hitler's resentments shaped his actions for years to come.
It's a great pity for mankind that he wasn't accepted into the Academy. For a career as a mediocre painter, Germany would have been spared a dictator.
On August the 2nd, 1914, 25-year-old Hitler can be seen in the crowd jamming the streets of Munich to hear a fateful announcement. Germany had declared war on Russia and Serbia.
The photograph shows the beginning of Hitler's career, and he's filled with ecstasy because he's going to fight for a greater Germany. He's identifying himself personally with the cause of a greater Germany.
This gave Hitler, for the first time in his life, a real sense of purpose. He'd found his role. He belonged for the first time somewhere.
As a courier on the front line, Hitler was both brave and lucky. After several brushes with death, he was promoted to corporal and decorated. In October of 1918, he was temporarily blinded in a mustard gas attack by the British.
While he was recovering, he heard of the German surrender, and this was a devastating piece of news for him.
For the Germans, the end of the First World War was a devastating shock. In November of 1918, when the armistice was signed, German troops were still deep inside France. They occupied all of Belgium. They defeated the Russians. Also, during the course of the war, the German High Command had fed the population a steady diet of good news.
Germans at home had no idea that Germany was losing the war. So as far as most Germans were concerned, even in the last months of the war, Germany was winning.
And then suddenly, inexplicably, in November of 1918, Germany has been defeated. This strange defeat would give rise to the stab-in-the-back theory, that the army, the valiant German army, had been stabbed in the back by some sort of domestic coalition of left liberals, meaning Jews, the Catholic Center Party, and the Social Democrats, the Marxists.
The myth itself is nonsense. The German Army High Command said in September and October 1918 that there was no way forward, that the German armies were exhausted, that Germany was at the edge of catastrophe. The big lie is the stab in the back.
In the months following the German surrender, the country was near anarchy. There was a communist revolution and a counter-revolution. And then in February 1919, in a bitterly divided Germany, a fragile democracy emerged.
But now you've got hundreds of thousands, indeed millions of armed troops back in Germany, believing that they had been stabbed in the back. These would furnish the rank and file of a new wave of paramilitary organizations, which was important because many Nazis would be recruited from these units.
The government secretly allowed paramilitary organizations to flourish because the terms of the treaty that ended World War I limited the German army to a mere 100,000 soldiers. One of the paramilitary leaders was Ernst Röhm, known as the Machine Gun King for his stockpile of weapons culled from returning soldiers. He met Hitler in Munich at a meeting of the tiny German Workers' Party, which soon became the Nazi Party. Hitler was a rousing right-wing orator, railing against the Jews, the leftists, and the national government in Berlin. And then in 1923, an economic collapse plunged the country into turmoil.
And the German government responded with the printing press. They printed money until trillions of marks equaled $1 American.
The southern German state of Bavaria had become a magnet for right-wing radicals, including Hitler. And in the midst of this crisis, the state commissar of Bavaria, Gustav von Kahr, thought the time was right to overthrow the national government in Berlin.
At this moment, von Kahr and others saw in Hitler a very useful ally. Here was this man with great energy who could be recruited for the toppling of the government in Berlin.
With Rome's paramilitary forces and Hitler's ability to inspire them, Rome and Hitler were well positioned to assist von Kahr with any revolt.
At the same time, Hitler saw a possible coalition to hatch a coup. A putsch is the German term for coup. Hitler saw an opportunity. This might be the objective revolutionary situation that he could use.
But when von Kahr was warned off by the head of the German army in Berlin, von Kahr decided to wait. Hitler was outraged. He brought his stormtroopers to the brink, and he could not back down.
At that point, Hitler has reached the position where if he pulls away from the putsch now, if he doesn't go through with it, his standing in the paramilitaries might be blown once and for all. So Hitler then decides to go for it.
Hitler gathered his stormtroopers outside a large beer hall where von Kahr was making a speech. Storming the stage, Hitler fired a shot into the ceiling and proclaimed that the revolution had begun. He called for a march against the government and led his followers out into the streets.
Hitler's notions seemed to be that once this march took place, somehow the population would rally round the march, so the masses would rise up against the Berlin government.
But the masses did not rise up. As Hitler and his stormtroopers approached a large square, they were confronted by the Munich police. It is unclear who fired the first shot, but within minutes, 14 stormtroopers and 4 police lay dead. Hitler suffered only a dislocated shoulder.
Hitler himself was injured when the person he was linking arms with was shot dead. So what if the bullets had been 18 inches to the side? Again, world history would have been different.
Hitler managed to escape, but 2 days later he was arrested and taken to Landsberg prison. As he awaited trial for high treason, he told the prison psychologist, "I'm finished. If I had a revolver, I would use it."
But from this political catastrophe, well, catastrophe, it was ludicrous. Hitler would, of course, in the trial in the spring of 1924, transform what had been a terrific political setback into a political triumph.
He turned to the judges directly and said, "Judge, I am guilty. I am responsible. You also want this democracy to be ended, but you don't have the courage. I have the courage to stand for my principles. And if that makes me guilty, then I admit it, guilty as charged, because I have a vision of this country, born in the trenches of 1914. And the rhetoric went on, and headlines all over Germany reported it everywhere.
The right-wing court was sympathetic to his argument and had no interest in making a martyr out of Hitler.
He received the minimum sentence. It was 5 years. He was not going to spend that long in prison. He would be out in less than a year. He might have been executed for this crime of high treason. Instead, Hitler was put into a minimum security facility. In the photographs, he's sitting wearing lederhosen, a nice ruffly white shirt. Geraniums are in the windows. The room was so filled with his sycophants who had come to listen to his words of wisdom that Hitler finally had to tell his jailers to please restrict admission to his cell because he couldn't get any work done. He had no privacy.
The time in Landsberg prison was a turning point for Hitler. Here he would work to shed his identity as a rabble-rouser and recast himself as a visionary politician. It was in Landsberg that he wrote the first volume of Mein Kampf, My Struggle, part Nazi manifesto, part boastful biography. It was also a record of what he had learned from his failed coup.
From this failure, Hitler draws an important lesson, that he's going to have to use democratic politics to become a mass political movement. Basically, he's going to have to learn the lessons of democracy in order to take revolutionary power.
He never did anything like this again. He never marched on Berlin, say, in 1933. He understood that in a democracy with fully developed mass media, you can't have a revolution like Lenin did by overthrowing the institutions. No, he said, you have to use the institutions of democracy to defeat democracy. First, you get legally established in power, and then you erode the democracy. You destroy the democracy after you seize power.
On December the 20th, 1924, Hitler was released from Landsberg prison. In 1929, with the onset of the Great Depression, Hitler moved from the margins to the mainstream of German politics. In keeping with his democratic strategy, a remarkably modern political operation had been established. The Nazi Party's nationwide network of offices would be familiar to any precinct captain in American politics. Its mission was to put out the Nazi message.
Hitler was interested in propaganda, pure and simple. That was their job. The grassroots organizations were to gather information. What did people like? What didn't they like? What played well? What didn't play well? And then to send that information back up the chain of command. What they had in mind was a very crude form of political survey research.
And you even have the stormtroopers rebuilt to carry out propaganda. Not to be playing soldier or carrying out a military putsch, but to work as a propaganda troop. And what this means in Hitler's view is passing out pamphlets, marching demonstrations, flags, the use of political violence against one's opponents, the disruption of opponents' meetings and all this sort of thing. That's still legal as long as it's directed against your opponents and not the government.
The Nazis' main opponents were the communists who were preaching revolution. When Hitler called for their destruction, many middle-class Germans approved.
If you saw a group of stormtroopers coming down the street, marching with the military band, with flags waving, maybe chanting, maybe singing, this was looked upon with great favor. And if it then became involved in fights with those on the left, that was good propaganda as well, because it showed the Nazis meant when they said they were going to get rid of the Marxists.
Hitler was a relentless campaigner. He went to as many as 20 cities in 7 days. One of his most effective themes was that democracy doesn't work.
Hitler ridiculed the system, and it was so easy to ridicule.
Ich habe mir ein Ziel gesteckt, nämlich die 30 Parteien aus Deutschland hinauszufegen.
In one of the most effective speeches, he says, people in Germany say I'm un-German because I want to end this miserable system, a system dominated by 37 political parties. I was just recently looking, he says, at the electoral list from the state of Lippe, that's the sort of Rhode Island of Germany, the smallest German state. What do I find? 37 different political parties.
Die Arbeiterschaft, ihre eigenen Parteien, und zwar nicht eine, das wäre zu wenig, es müssen gleich 3, 4 sein. Das Bürgertum, das so intelligenter ist, braucht ja noch mehr Parteien. Der Landmann auch die eigene Partei, und zwar auch gleich 3, 4. Und die Herren Hausbesitzer müssen ihre besonderen Interessen politischer Art, weltanschaulicher Art, auch durch eine Partei vertreten lassen.
It is an absolutely wicked speech. And a great many Germans who were not drawn by the ideology, the expansionist, racist ideology of the party, saw this as a vision of a Germany united.
Well, at that time, this was a very powerful message, this idea of national unity. The greater the disintegration, the greater seemed to be the attraction of one movement, claiming that it could transcend all the divisions of Germany, and out of the ashes would rise a new phoenix, and Germany would be great again.
They were young, they were dynamic, and people could feel that they were contributing to an effort that was greater than any one of them individually. And particularly the women said, we belong to our movement. Not a party, a movement, a subculture, a community. And anyone who comes in can have access to our soup kitchens. We have a sewing co-op. We have child care for the children. We have a singing society. And in fact, demographically, the largest block of Hitler voters were women. He spoke about the masses as feminine, as susceptible to a kind of ecstatic experience. And if you watch his speeches, was of course a fiery speaker, and he would thunder and he would pound on the podium and he would march around and he would strut. And then he would also step back during the applause and push his hair out of his eyes and almost have a soft image. And when you read the accounts by men as well as by women about how they found Hitler, there's almost no difference in the language of conversion experience between men and women.
But behind the pageantry and the propaganda was another Hitler.
A number of studies of Hitler's rise place emphasis on the sophistication of his propaganda, on the deep sociological forces and the economic traumas. All these things are important, but it's important to remember Hitler's party murdered the best and brightest of his political opponents for years on end, and that by crippling and terrorizing his opponents, that was at least, if not more important, than abstract economic and sociological forces in allowing Hitler to come to power.
Germans could read the truth about Hitler. A group of reporters risked their lives to tell the world about the Nazi Party. The most determined were the journalists of the Munich Post.
Hitler gave lip service to the idea that he would only be pursuing power through methods of legality. What's so important about the Munich Post coverage is they reveal how much of a lie this was. To these reporters, this was a homicide story. Hitler was more a gangster than a serious politician.
Year after year, for everyone to see, there were front-page stories about stabbings and drownings, and how members of the opposition parties simply disappeared.
Hitler often dispatched Nazi Party stormtroopers to the offices of the Munich Post, where they would sack and pillage the offices and terrorize the people who were there. They risked their lives to set the record straight. They had a slogan, "Hitler has no secrets from us." And in fact, they were able to produce, one after another, secret Nazi Party documents, the most important of which being, I believe, the Nazi Party plan for the Jews.
The Munich Post reported in December 1931 that the Nazi Party had a written plan for the fate of the Jews.
This secret plan used the phrase, final solution, the key euphemism for the extermination, mass murder, genocide that Hitler would later carry out. It's a sensationally important story because it reveals that Hitler was contemplating the final solution as far back as 1931.
But despite the daily front-page revelations, Hitler's popularity continued to rise. From 18% in the elections of September 1930 to 30% in the spring of 1932. In the face of Hitler's growing political strength, the reporter Fritz Gerlich decided to use Hitler's own racist views against him.
Fritz Gerlich's attack on Hitler, called "Does Hitler Have Mongolian Blood?" was a brilliant insight into Hitler's racial pathology. What it did was take Hitler's so-called racial science, take all the measurements of noses and chins and facial parts that all these quack racist scientists that Hitler gathered around him had developed and published in textbooks. Take them, put them alongside photographs of Hitler, and see how Hitler's nose measured up, how Hitler's chin measured up, how his eyes, the spacing of his eyes. He subjected Hitler to his own ridiculous racist science and found that Hitler was not the perfect Aryan. Hitler had more in common with Genghis Khan's Mongolians. But what he's really doing in this satire is really struggling for the soul of the German people. He's saying, don't look at the shape of noses, look at beliefs. Look at beliefs that we can be proud of, beliefs in individual liberty, rather than physiognomy. And unfortunately, he lost that struggle for the German soul to Adolf Hitler.
On July 31st, 1932, Hitler scored his greatest political triumph to date. The Nazi Party won 37% of the vote, the largest of any party in Germany. It seemed that Hitler could not be stopped. In 1932, Germany's head of state was the president, Paul von Hindenburg, the legendary leader of the army in World War I. He was the only man in the country who could appoint the German chancellor, the head of government, if there was no majority party in parliament. Hindenburg was 84 years old and presided over a country so divided that national elections were being called almost every 2 months. When Hitler won 37% of the vote in the July elections, Nazi supporters expected Hindenburg to make Hitler the chancellor. But Hindenburg despised Hitler. He thought he was a reckless upstart from the lower class, never to be trusted with power. But without the Nazis, a coalition government could not be formed. Hindenburg offered Hitler the vice-chancellorship. Hitler refused. For him, it was all or nothing.
When Hitler refuses, those not in the hardcore of the party, particularly middle-class people that were not committed National Socialists, they said, well, why not enter the government? We voted for you because you were going to go in and clean the house, and now you've had the opportunity, you've not done it. Are you just like all the other parties that talk, but then don't do anything?
The disillusionment of middle-class voters was only part of Hitler's problem. His own party was in open rebellion.
Hardcore Nazis, the stormtroopers, they didn't want to go into the government as some kind of coalition partner. They wanted to seize power. They thought this was going to happen in August after the election. And now it hadn't happened.
In their minds, many of them were beginning to think the legal campaign is not working. And maybe this was never going to work, and you should go back to the old ideas of 1923 and try to take over by violence.
The stormtroopers, on their own, not with orders from above, simply conducted a campaign of terror.
The violence was getting out of hand. They began to attack local officials and respectable middle-class Germans, and this made many people begin to realize the true character and begin to draw back.
The collapse of Nazi support was immediately clear in the 5th election of the year. On November the 6th, Hitler suffered a devastating defeat. The Nazis lost over 2 million votes and dropped 34 seats in the parliament.
The Nazi vote had dropped like a stone. Hitler's propaganda staff produced a top-secret report, and it says, we've blown it.
There was an even greater blow in early December when Gregor Strasser, head of the party's political machine and Hitler's second-in-command, suddenly resigned in protest because of Hitler's all-or-nothing policy.
Strasser, out of the blue, resigns all his party offices. Major crisis in the party, major debacle for Hitler, prestige loss and so on. Hitler's response was to summon together all his most trusted chieftains and addresses them then in a melodramatic performance with tears rolling down his cheeks, threats of suicide if the party breaks up and so on. So at the end of 1932, the Nazi party's in a mess.
It was a heartbreaking moment of hope because it seemed that Hitler was on his way out. And there was a cartoon the Munich Post published that showed Hitler kicked out the doors of power by the electorate, and the Munich Post gives it a triumphant caption, Adolf Hitler on his belly again, in reference to the beer hall push when Hitler was seen to dive to the sidewalk. And here again, it seemed like he was on his belly again.
It was at this very moment, with Germany in yet another political stalemate, that Hitler was saved from obscurity by events over which he had little control. There are two common misconceptions about how Hitler first came to power. One, that he seized power through a military coup, a putsch in German, and two, that he was elected by the German public. Both are incorrect. In fact, Hitler's power was handed to him by conniving politicians who thought they could control him and use him to further their own ambitions. The man most responsible for Hitler's good fortune was Franz von Papen, the former Chancellor of Germany. At the beginning of 1933, he'd recently been replaced in office by a fierce political rival, the Minister of Defense, General Kurt von Schleicher. Deeply embittered by his sudden removal, Papen was determined to get even with Schleicher and get back in power. And so he made a deal with Hitler. He set out to convince President Hindenburg to appoint Hitler Chancellor. Papen would be Vice-Chancellor. He told President Hindenburg that Hitler, weakened by his failure in the last election, could be tamed, especially if he was surrounded by responsible politicians like Papen. Papen even said, "Don't worry, we've hired him." After a series of lies and deceptions designed to overcome Hindenburg's deep misgivings, the president finally agreed.
And so on January 30th, in what must be one of history's bitterest ironies, that at a moment when the Nazi constituency seemed to be unraveling, Hitler is appointed Chancellor.
That night, the Nazis staged a massive demonstration in Berlin. Hitler and Hindenburg waving from separate windows to the cheering crowds below. For Hitler, this was only the first step. His ultimate goal was absolute power. When Hitler took over as Chancellor, he faced the same problems as his predecessors. He had no majority in Parliament, and he had to stay in the good graces of the President, the only man who could remove him. This was not the absolute power Hitler had in mind. But quite quickly, a spectacular event helped him. A month after becoming Chancellor, the Reichstag, the German Parliament building, was set on fire. A former communist was arrested and put on trial, but for Hitler, the fire was a timely stroke of luck. It gave him an excuse for a brutal crackdown against his opposition on the left, the likes of which Germany had never seen.
They arrested the communists, They harassed and censored political parties, particularly the Social Democratic Party, the moderate socialists.
In addition, Hitler deputized the stormtroopers. They are now the police. It was the day they had been waiting for. They arrested so many people that the jails overflowed, and they had to create a new institution. It was called the Konzentrationslager, the concentration camp.
They just round up leaders of the Social Democratic and Communist Party, drag them down to one of these concentration camps or torture cellars, take them there, beat them, in some cases murder them.
If husbands went into exile, the Nazis would arrest the wives and children and throw them into concentration camps. The terror, the reprisals were instant.
And as long as it's directed against the left, it's condoned and tolerated by large elements of the middle class.
On March the 21st, the reopening of Parliament provided a propaganda opportunity to recast the Nazi Party's image of brutality and radicalism. To create the illusion of continuity between the old and new regimes, Hitler chose the Garrison Church for the ceremony, the great shrine of Imperial Germany, where Kaiser Wilhelm held court and Frederick the Great was buried.
This day was a carefully orchestrated event by the Nazis aimed at reassuring conservative Germans and President Hindenburg that Hitler was not some wild-eyed radical who's going to turn the country over to the stormtroopers.
It did bother some of Hitler's more radical supporters. They had some worries about the alacrity with which Hitler seemed to be joining with Hindenburg. But generally, this day played very well.
That was the turning point in public opinion. Movies were taken and fed directly into the newsreels, and it looked as if Hitler, dressed in civilian clothes very, very properly, had been tamed after all. Suddenly, it was respectable to support the Nazis.
The charade of a tamed Hitler was exactly that. Revealed by his plan to push through something called an enabling law, which would enable Hitler to rule by decree. He needed a two-thirds majority to get the enabling law passed. On the day of the vote, he left little to chance.
This meeting took place in a sea of stormtroopers. Stormtrooper units surrounded the Parliament building. They were inside. Some of them were, of course, members of the Parliament. And they made it very clear as other deputies came in that if they didn't vote for the Enabling Act, they may not go home that night.
As Hitler enters the chamber there was no doubt whatsoever of the need to impress a sense of fear and menace in the opposition on that day. And indeed, the opposition had been reduced, in effect, to the Social Democrats.
There's one capitulation that's particularly noteworthy. The representatives who had been elected by Catholic voters capitulated and signed on to Hitler's power. And so, in other words, the leaders of the political party did what the voters had refused to do, and that is to agree to Hitler becoming dictator.
The die was now cast, the Enabling Act passed by a huge majority, and that, of course, then set this dictatorship on its course.
By 1933, the Nazification of Germany, the reordering of German society under Hitler, took many forms.
At every level, an entire panoply of social clubs in almost every small town and village in Germany Nazified itself. Skittle clubs, gardening associations, singing clubs.
Hitler's portrait was to be found everywhere. His face was at the bottom of bowls, on cups, streets named after him, kids were named after him.
So there's an enormous set of impulses released from below here without all the time directives from above. Hitler does very little in these months in terms of any directives to coordinate these groupings.
One really good example of local initiatives is the book burnings in Berlin in May 1933, organized by university students acting on their own initiative, were not organized from above.
Leading German authors, Nobel Prize winners and so on, found their works then thrown on these bonfires which were rising up outside the buildings of all Germany's major universities. Initiatives taken by the students and by their professors.
But despite the seemingly unstoppable wave of popular support, one last obstacle to total power for Hitler remained. President Hindenburg and the German Army Command were increasingly concerned that the Nazi Party was out of control.
The Army still remained a very real threat to Nazi power. If the Army grew disaffected, if Hindenburg woke up one morning and decided this had all been a mistake and sent for a military attaché, who knew what could happen?
Their main concern was the stormtroopers. They'd grown to vast proportions and were now demanding their share of the spoils.
They've brought Hitler to power. What are they going to get in return? And by the summer of 1933, they really didn't have a purpose, because once they had been used to suppress the left, really their function was done as far as Hitler was concerned.
So as time went on, Hitler was faced with the dilemma that the stormtroopers, who by this time are acting as political hooligans, were causing a lot of trouble now with the army leadership. The army is increasingly worried about the threat of the stormtroopers to supplant its own position. And Hitler is being put on the spot of having to choose between the army and the stormtroopers.
Ernst Röhm, who still commanded the stormtroopers, had become a real threat to the German High Command.
Röhm now begins to call for the stormtroopers to be merged with the military. He wants to create a people's army, a revolutionary national socialist army.
But the Minister of Defense, General Werner von Blomberg, was well aware of Röhm's ambitions.
General Blomberg was quite concerned about Röhm and the stormtroopers. They'd served their purpose. They'd fulfilled their mission. And Röhm didn't seem to understand this. All of this incautious talk about absorbing the army and becoming a people's army and so on was not what Hitler wanted to hear, not what Blomberg wanted to hear.
Determined to avoid a confrontation and desperate to regain control, Hitler called the stormtroopers to a mass meeting.
Ich weiß es, meine Kameraden, es ist euch wohl oft schwer gefallen, wenn ihr meintet, es müsse und nun ein Wandel kommen und erklärt, es geht nicht, ihr dürft nicht handeln, ihr müsst gehorchen, ihr müsst euch fügen, ihr müsst euch diesem unerhörten Zwang beugen.
Despite Hitler's pleas, the conflict between the stormtroopers and the army was becoming a crisis. Adding to the urgency was the failing health of President Hindenburg.
Hindenburg was now seriously ill and unlikely to recover, and if the army didn't support Hitler as the head of state, Hitler would have been in a very difficult position indeed.
With the army, if the army could be brought on board, then total power would be in Hitler's hands.
So Hitler made his deal with the army. Blomberg agreed to support Hitler taking presidential powers when Hindenburg died if Hitler would deal with the stormtroopers' leader, Röhm.
But in the case of Ernst Röhm, he was dealing with one of his oldest co-fighters. He'd known Röhm since 1919. Röhm had been very influential in helping Hitler in the early years in Munich. And Hitler did have this streak in him, which was of some loyalty towards people who had, in his view, done him a great service in the past.
It's a hard dilemma for him. He'd been friends with Röhm since the beginning, and Röhm was one of the few people that Hitler talked to using the intimate form, the du form of address. But the precipitating event for Hitler to take action was that Hindenburg was going to die.
On June the 21st, 1934, Hitler went to visit the dying Hindenburg at his country estate.
And who should he meet there but Defense Minister Blomberg, who's just come away from seeing the ailing president, and Blomberg tells Hitler in no uncertain terms that he needs to act now against the stormtroopers.
The military is willing to do its part if Hitler will do his part. And Hitler decides to do his part in late June.
On June the 30th at 2 a.m., Hitler boarded a plane for Bavaria. He had called a meeting of the stormtrooper leadership to be held at a resort just outside Munich. Hitler arrived at dawn and was driven to the hotel where Röhm and the others were sound asleep, utterly unprepared for what was about to happen. Hitler stormed up the stairs with his pistol drawn. He burst in on Rome and arrested him. As the secret police stalked the halls, breaking through doors and yanking the stormtrooper leaders from their beds. They were all taken to Stadelheim prison in Munich. There, the murders began. Most of them were shot within hours. But on Hitler's orders, Rome was given a choice. He was handed a gun. He could take his own life. He declined. So standing in his cell, he was shot in the head. Meanwhile, in Berlin, the SS rounded up 150 other high-ranking stormtroopers and took them to the Lichterfeld Cadet School, where they were lined up against the wall and shot by a firing squad. This was only the beginning. Hitler had old scores to settle. When former Chancellor von Schleicher answered his door, he was met by a gunman. When his wife came running, she was murdered too. Gregor Strasser, the former head of Hitler's political operation, was dragged to the basement of Gestapo headquarters, where he was murdered. Fritz Skerlich, the Munich reporter already imprisoned at Dachau, was shot in the head and his blood-splattered glasses delivered to his widow. Even Gustav von Kahr, the former Bavarian commissar who wouldn't go ahead with the beer hall putsch 11 years earlier, was remembered that day by Hitler as a traitor. He was found hacked to death in a ditch. The killings continued through the following afternoon as Hitler gave a tea party in the Chancellery Gardens.
Just about a month later, on August 2nd, Reich President Hindenburg died. And on that day, indeed, that very same day, the army now let the other shoe drop. It now came the payment. The army swore personal allegiance, not to the German Constitution, not to the German people, not to the German state, but to the person of Adolf Hitler. The last obstacle to total power in Germany had been eliminated.
Adolf Hitler! Feuer! Feuer! Feuer!
In the years after 1934, Adolf Hitler wielded power with a brutality that few people believe possible. Some people managed to escape and make it to the United States. Many of them were Jews, and a few of them were, at the time, among the world's most brilliant scientists. Our second story begins when they realized that there is one power that Hitler must never have. When the race to build the atomic bomb began, the fear was that it would be used in the name of evil. After the world saw what the first bombs had done at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the fear became that such a weapon existed at all. On September the 23rd, 1949, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic device. The Soviets got the complete plans of a bomb from their spies at Los Alamos.
Their first bomb was based on our plans. Los Alamos not only designed the first American atomic bomb, it also designed the first Soviet atomic bomb.
The U.S. responded by developing the hydrogen bomb, 800 times more powerful than the one dropped on Hiroshima. Within a year, the Soviets had a hydrogen bomb.
Everything had changed. It was no longer possible seriously to consider world-scale war.
In 40 years, there were more than 60,000 nuclear weapons on the face of the earth. After the Soviets, the French, the Chinese, the Israelis, the Pakistanis, the Indians, the South Africans have all built nuclear weapons. But the bomb has not been used again. So far, man has had to recognize that there are limits to his impulses.
If there is an all-out nuclear war, it's the end of civilization.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of The Century. The next one is on Saturday night. I'm Peter Jennings. Good night. In the years after 1934, Adolf Hitler wielded power with a brutality that few people believed possible. Some people managed to escape and make it to the United States. Many of them were Jews, and a few of them were, at the time, among the world's most brilliant scientists. Our second story begins when they realized that there is one power that Hitler must never have. Let's go back to Germany. The streets of Berlin, 1938. The dark forces of human nature have already gathered here. They appear unmistakably in the face of Hitler, now wielding absolute power in Germany. They echo in the footsteps of these men, who will before long make much of Europe their prisoner. They are clear in the growing terror visited on the Jews. There is another force about to be revealed here in Berlin. On a gray December day in a government laboratory, a German chemist split atoms of uranium. In a simple experiment, he discovered the key to unlocking the enormous energy stored inside the atom. In no time, news of the discovery reached other scientists all over the world.
The general view was that no one would ever live to see nuclear energy. That was just totally impossible.
And all around there was a buzz for a few days that week, and all the experiments had something to show. Couldn't resist talking about it, speculating. War was in the air.
The way was very clear, from fission to a power reactor and a bomb. And I think people understood that right from the start.
And it was clear that there could be an explosive of power far beyond anything that had previously been seen.
One man had seen it coming. Leo Szilard had been worrying about the possibility of an atomic bomb for years, when it was still science fiction. Szilard was an eccentric, Hungarian-born physicist who had worked in Germany for a dozen years. He was one of the first Jewish scientists to understand that Hitler threatened the world, and he had left Germany in 1933 and was living in New York when he heard the news.
Szilard, alone among his colleagues, was deathly frightened of the news that the uranium atom would split, because he had left Germany as a refugee where he knew the best physics had been going on.
Szilard in particular realized immediately that the fact that nuclear fission had been discovered meant that Nazi Germany might well already be at work on an atomic bomb. And the idea of a Third Reich with atomic bombs to enforce its horrors horrified him. Szilard, semi-penniless, recent emigre, characteristically thought, how can I reach the President of the United States with this extraordinary fact? And he thought, well, Einstein's famous, let's go talk to him.
Albert Einstein and Leo Szilard had been friends in Berlin in the years before Hitler. Szilard took another Hungarian scientist with him to the meeting, the young Edward Teller.
He called me and asked me to do one thing he cannot do. He could not drive a car. And he wanted to talk to Einstein, so I was employed as his chauffeur.
Einstein was at his summer home on New York's Long Island. The two men recreated the meeting years later as an historical record. Einstein was a pacifist, but he was also a Jewish refugee from Germany, and his fear of the Nazis was profound. Szilard was certain that with Einstein's name on a letter to President Roosevelt, the president would take their warning seriously. The Einstein letter was to be delivered to the president personally, but by the time it got to him, events in Europe had taken a dramatic turn. On September the 1st, 1939, Hitler invaded Poland. In only a month, Poland crumbled and the widespread massacre of the Polish Jews began.
The defeat of Poland, I expected, as did everybody. But the defeat of France was a terrible shock.
Hans Bethe was another gifted scientist who'd been forced to leave Germany because of his Jewish heritage. He too had fled to the United States.
We saw that perhaps European culture would be completely destroyed by the Nazis, who were acting as savages, truly as savages, both mentally and physically.
A month after the invasion of Poland, when Roosevelt finally received the Einstein letter, he was not convinced by its urgency. All he did was authorize the formation of a research committee so the scientists could meet with the military. But when Szilard and a few colleagues finally sat down with the Army and the Navy, they were not taken seriously.
The Army representative was totally skeptical. Understandably, people were talking about 5-10 pounds of a rather exotic piece of metal destroying a city. And remember, these were men who had just come from Europe. Most of them had heavy accents, Hungarian, Italian, German. They looked like classic crackpots.
Szilard is going crazy at this time. He's been living with this fear for years. He hears rumors from immigrant scientists that the Germans are really working. He's becoming more frantic. He's trying to spur his colleagues on to work harder and harder, and at the same time, he's powerless.
The refugee scientists in America heard specific news that few people even noticed, and it convinced them of Hitler's intentions about an atomic bomb. The German War Department had taken over the country's finest laboratory, and the Nazi government had outlawed the export of uranium from Czechoslovakia, which the German army now occupied. Czechoslovakia was the principal source of uranium in Europe. There was no doubt that the German bomb project had begun. December 7th, 1941, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. When America went to war, it committed itself completely to the war effort. The war gave a new sense of urgency to the top-secret atomic bomb program. Leo Szilard finally got what he wanted.
So my wife and I were just about to sign up for the Army Air Corps, and this professor, his name was Joyce Stern, says, "Don't do that. Wait a couple of weeks. I think there's something that'll be more important and be better for you and better for the country." So we waited, and next thing I knew, I was on my way to Chicago.
At the University of Chicago, Agnew joined Leo Szilard and a small group of scientists led by the Italian Nobel Prize winner Enrico Fermi. They worked tirelessly to prove that the atomic bomb could be built. And they were convinced the Germans were still years ahead.
We were always worried as to what the Germans were doing. You must keep in mind that the center for all this activity pre-war was in Germany. Fermi had studied in Germany, Bethe was in Germany, Szilard was there. The Center for Nuclear Physics Study was in Germany. And so we always worried about what the Germans were up to.
It was a troubling time for Szilard. Even while pushing the scientists to produce a bomb before the Germans, he worried what impact this weapon might have on the future of the world. On the morning of December the 2nd, 1942, 1 year after Pearl Harbor, the scientists were on the brink of a breakthrough. In a squash court under the abandoned football stadium at the University of Chicago, Szilard and Fermi had designed and built the world's first nuclear reactor. The Germans had discovered that by firing a neutron into a uranium atom, the atom would split, releasing a burst of energy. But the splitting atom would also release something else, more neutrons, which would split other nearby atoms. Fermi and Szilard believed that with the uranium properly arranged in a reactor, they could create a chain reaction that would expand to split billions of atoms and release vast amounts of energy. If they succeeded, they would prove the basic principle for a bomb. But it was a dangerous experiment. The scientists had packed the uranium in blocks of graphite, which would slow down the process and keep the reaction under control. But if this experimental reaction went too fast, it might explode. like a bomb. On the cold, dimly lit squash court, the scientists watched as the experiment began. Fermi ran the reactor for 28 minutes. For a moment, these scientists had harnessed the most basic energy in the universe. The atomic bomb was now more than a theoretical possibility.
Szilard went up and shook hands with Fermi and said, "I think this is going to be a black day in the history of mankind." He saw that this would lead to a nuclear arms race. He saw that this would spread atomic energy not for peaceful but for military purposes.
By the end of 1942, the Manhattan Project, as the program was now called, had already been placed in the hands of the military. The man in charge was a hard-driving, decisive Army general named Leslie Groves. His orders were clear: finish a bomb as soon as possible. Within a week of taking over, Groves purchased 59,000 acres in rural Tennessee, where he planned to build a plant to enrich uranium. 4 months later, he decided to buy 500,000 acres in eastern Washington for massive reactors to make plutonium. Groves was a bold and often abrasive military man who did not think much of the scientists. He took an instant dislike to Leo Szilard.
Szilard was mortally offended, understandably. He was partly offended because he realized that there were moral issues involved in this, which I think Groves wasn't interested in at all. This was a weapon. You built the weapon, then the properly constituted officials decided what to do with the weapon. But Szilard understood that it was a weapon that would destroy cities, and that there were weapons beyond it, hydrogen weapons that would destroy countries, and that there were very deep issues about war and humanity and human rights that needed to be a part of all of this discussion.
General Groves thought Szilard and his concerns were a danger to the project, but Groves did not understand atomic science, and he knew he needed a scientific director if he was going to have a working weapon. He turned to J. Robert Oppenheimer, who was teaching theoretical physics at the University of California.
It was a very unlikely choice in the eyes of most of his colleagues. He had never been an administrator. He was a teacher. He seemed rather ethereal and poetic and literary from the point of view of physicists who tend to be some pretty practical kind of engineering-like guys. But General Groves went out to see him, and Groves was dazzled.
Oppenheimer came from a wealthy New York family. He'd been educated at Harvard and had a passion for metaphysical poetry and Eastern philosophy. Military intelligence objected to Oppenheimer's ties to the Communist Party. The FBI had actually placed him on a list of Americans to be arrested in case of national emergency. But General Groves saw only a brilliant scientist who believed deeply in the importance of building a bomb which would end the war. Unlike Szilard, Robert Oppenheimer believed that the bomb would be a benefit to mankind because it would make future wars impossible. Over the objections of military intelligence, Groves got his man. Robert Oppenheimer set out to recruit the best scientific minds in the country for a project so secret that most were told nothing except that their country needed them and they should go to an address in Santa Fe. Boyce McDaniel and Ken Greisen came from Cornell University.
Arriving at Santa Fe, it was quite an experience. You know, you're going into a circumstance you've never, don't know quite what you're getting into, and you're going to be there a while, a long while.
It was wild. I mean, we drove on a little highway up to a certain point and then turned off on something that started out being a little dirt road, and we were sure we were lost. And then we climbed a steep, winding road up to a mesa, and we were still sure we were lost. But ultimately, we came to a little guardhouse with a soldier at it. That we knew we were in the right area.
They had arrived at Los Alamos. 26-year-old Martin Deutsch had fled Austria and was working at MIT.
It had sort of a Shangri-La unreality to it. The whole atmosphere, of course, had something unreal about it. You got there and you saw all the great names in the field. It was a very exciting thing.
Los Alamos was a paradise for scientists. You met the people the scientists about whom you only read in books,
Joseph Rotblat was a physicist who'd been in England when the Germans invaded his native Poland. And Phil Morrison had been working on the Manhattan Project at the University of Chicago.
It was a tiny community of old friends or old acquaintances and people with a great common interest. So it was an amazing experience.
Conspicuously absent at Los Alamos was Leo Szilard. His conflicts with General Groves kept him in Chicago. But soon there were hundreds of scientists working in New Mexico.
I did not know with any certainty that the project was a bomb project. Not that I was opposed to it. Of course one had to do it if it was possible, because I'm sure the enemy had no hesitation doing it. I had not the slightest hesitation about that. But I felt, like many of my colleagues, almost to the end, that what we really hoped we would find was that it couldn't be done.
The main reason for pursuing the work was to make sure it couldn't be done. If it couldn't be done, then nobody could have it.
Everyone seemed to understand that time was precious. Oppenheimer organized the scientists into divisions: experimental physics, theoretical physics, chemistry, metallurgy, and ordnance. Hans Bethe was given the key job of running the theoretical division. The Manhattan Project now had hundreds of the country's brightest minds. At Los Alamos alone, there were 4 Nobel Prize winners and 10 others who would go on to win the prize in later years. The hard work was driven by the news from overseas. American forces were struggling north through Italy and across the islands of the Pacific. Everyone knew someone who'd gone to war.
There was a time when we thought we were losing the war. Because a lot of my friends, gosh, a whole gang of them had been killed in the Pacific as well as in Italy and in Germany. And I think we were just really motivated. You really wanted to win, end the damn thing.
We were not living high on a mountainside, ignoring the rest of the world at all. We were very much concerned with the progress of the war.
The war was not going well. I was convinced that the Germans were working on the bomb. I thought they probably were ahead of us, way ahead of us.
By 1944, the Manhattan Project had been given the military's highest priority. More than 100,000 people were working at half a dozen sites around the country. 6,000 men and women were working at Los Alamos.
When Los Alamos was set up, it was supposed to be a total of 30 scientists. I mean, it was supposed to be much easier than it actually turned out to be.
We worked 6 days a week, and people enjoyed it. I just thought everything was great. I would say it was, to me, those years, it would be 43 through 45 were the most exciting years in my life. The atmosphere, the intellectual level, it was just fantastic.
Well, we worked pretty hard, but it was a young community, I was just a kid, just barely finished graduate work.
Yes, we worked together and we played together by and large. We weren't parties all the time, but there were pretty regularly people gather in someone's home. We didn't talk business particularly when we were off because we weren't supposed to go around chatting about our work. But we just had a good time.
The general was very upset with the reproduction rate at Los Alamos. And they didn't like building these big hospitals and having the doctors and all that. But there wasn't much he could do about that. Of course, everybody was young.
The average age was 25.
It was such a compelling common bond among us. No one there ever forgets it. Yes, there were hardships. Yes, there were difficulties. Yes, there was an impossible problem. Yes, there were even tragedies. And we knew the whole thing was tragic in its essence. But it seems to be a necessity thrust upon us by this history.
The Allied landing at Normandy, June the 6th, 1944.
I remember very vividly the invasion of Normandy and thinking that, boy, I sure hope the Germans don't have the bomb, because we had 1 million men in a square mile or two there.
I know that there was always the talk, well, that they might, how fast are we going, and how presumably they could do it just as fast as we could do it, if not faster.
A German atomic bomb might have put a stop to the Allied invasion of Europe, but the Allied forces pushed on across France and into Germany. General Groves was determined to find out what the Germans were doing and to keep any bomb information or material away from America's Russian allies, who were advancing from the east. The general created a special unit to scour the countryside for evidence of the German bomb program. In one place, they caught German scientists trying to escape. In another, the team confiscated German uranium, which they shipped home immediately so that it could be used at Los Alamos. The search team's scientific director, Samuel Goodschmidt, was a Dutch physicist who'd been living in the United States. He did not find much evidence of a bomb, but he did discover the fate of his parents. They had died in one of the concentration camps, now being liberated by Allied troops. It was a grim reminder of the evil which the Allies were racing against. In April, with the Allies closing in on Berlin, President Roosevelt died from a massive cerebral hemorrhage. And a virtually unknown politician became the 33rd President of the United States. When Harry Truman took the oath of office on April the 12th, 1945, he'd been Vice President for only 82 days. He had met with President Roosevelt only twice, and he had never heard of the atomic bomb. Within weeks, Germany was on the verge of defeat. April the 30th, 1945, with the Allies closing in on his underground bunker, Adolf Hitler took his own life, his dream of a German Reich in ruins around him. The Allies discovered that Hitler had denied his atomic scientists the resources they needed to build the weapon. He'd never understood the potential of the atomic bomb. On the 8th of May, 1945, Germany officially surrendered. At Los Alamos, a few scientists began to reconsider what they were doing, now that the threat of a German bomb no longer existed.
The whole purpose of my being on the project, namely to prevent Hitler from having his bomb, seemed to be misplaced. So I immediately said, okay, in this case, I am resigning from the project. Because the whole purpose of my being there is no longer. If the Germans are not making the bomb, therefore, there's no reason why we should make the bomb.
It is true that it's also hard to understand why the enthusiasms for continuing the work continued at Los Alamos, even after the Germans clearly were out of the war. But, of course, that was true for the whole country. It wasn't just us. The war had become an indissoluble war. There were two fronts. We had to win them both.
Virtually all of the scientists at Los Alamos stayed with the project.
We knew the Japanese war was a very bitter war, and the project had momentum of its own, so it automatically went on.
So somewhere around there, it became not a weapon to end a war or a weapon to beat someone else to the weapon, but a new weapon.
In Chicago, Leo Szilard was still concerned with the long-term consequences of the bomb. He had been dedicated to beating the Germans, But with Germany defeated, Szilard feared that American use of the bomb in Japan would only force the Soviet Union to build a bomb as well.
But Szilard always was about 5 years ahead of everybody else, of course, and I mean, he saw that this would be a catastrophe if it went on. That, I mean, he clearly saw the United States and the Soviet Union accumulating these bombs in huge quantities, and he wanted to get in there first and stop it.
Leo Szilard had once warned President Roosevelt about the need to build a bomb. Now he felt the need to warn President Truman that it must stop. In May of 1945, Szilard managed to arrange a meeting with the president, but when he got to the White House, he was sent instead to Spartanburg, South Carolina, to see Truman's chief advisor, former Senator James Burns. Burns was about to become Truman's Secretary of State. He'd never heard of Leo Szilard.
Szilard was trying to warn Burns about a post-war nuclear arms race with Russia. Well, Burns was just the wrong person to talk to. Burns considered himself knowledgeable in atomic energy. He thought that the bomb would make the Russians more manageable in Europe after the war. And so the one person who wanted to control the bomb and the one person who wanted to use it found themselves in the same living room, talking at odds.
A few weeks later, Burns and Truman left for the Potsdam Conference outside Berlin. President Truman would meet the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin for the first time and consult with the Allies about how to end the war against Japan. Truman knew that a test of the bomb was imminent. The scientists had carved out a test site in a barren stretch of New Mexico desert. Robert Oppenheimer named it Trinity. On July the 11th, Phil Morrison was driven the 200 miles from Los Alamos to the test site with the world's first plutonium core in the trunk.
So one fine day, it came the day, and I drove down in a car at 75 miles an hour all the way down to the desert, probably the most dangerous activity that I ever engaged in the war.
In the stifling desert heat, they began the painstaking final assembly of the world's first atomic device. Oppenheimer supervised the work personally.
The sphere had an opening plug, sort of like a plugged watermelon. It had an opening all the way down, and you would work down through that hole to put the active material in the center.
Packed neatly at the center of the thousands of pounds of high explosives was the small plutonium core. But in addition to the precision-made components, the first bomb was put together with cardboard, tissue paper, and household masking tape. 2 days before the test, on July the 14th, the assembled bomb was hoisted slowly into the steel tower. Army mattresses were put underneath, just in case the winch broke. In all, 32 separate detonators would have to be wired to the explosives once it was in the tower. Each detonator was set to fire within millionths of a second.
Ultimately, I and 2 young men from my group were the ones to climb the tower and wire up the detonators connected, put them in place on the bomb. And it was a little bit scary being up there with all that high explosive because an electrical storm came up too. I mean, rain and lightning and that sort of thing. So for many hours we were just hanging around there, very, very tense and so on. It was a long, long night.
The senior staff placed bets on how powerful the bomb would be. Edward Teller put in his dollar and guessed it would be equivalent to 45,000 tons of TNT. Hans Bethe guessed 8,000 tons. Enrico Fermi was taking side bets on the possibility that the bomb would incinerate the state of New Mexico or even ignite the atmosphere and destroy the world. General Groves was not amused. On the day of the test, July the 16th, President Truman was taken on a tour of Berlin. He wrote in his diary, "Never have I seen a more sorrowful sight. I hope for some sort of peace, But I fear that the machines are ahead of morals by some centuries. In New Mexico, all the observers had been given dark welder's glass to shield their eyes. They lay flat in the dirt of shallow trenches to protect them from the blast. At 5:29 a.m., 5 miles from ground zero, cameras inside heavy bunkers were rolling.
I was very, very shaken. If somebody says, I say, my God, that's what we've been doing. And then it was such a beautiful thing. That was the other thing. It was really beautiful, and that was another thing that left me very puzzled.
Hans Bethe.
First, I thought, we have done our job. And second, I thought, what a terrible thing have we created. This really can destroy the world.
Robert Oppenheimer.
We knew the world would not be the same. Few people laughed. Few people cried. Most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. I suppose we all thought that, one way or another.
The last year of the Pacific War was the killing year. The fighting dragged on for week after week at enormous cost in human life. The Japanese were unwilling to surrender despite their staggering losses. President Truman's military commanders had begun to discuss an invasion of the Japanese home islands, a chilling prospect for the tens of thousands of American soldiers being assembled in the Pacific.
And it very much looked as if the closer we got to the Japanese home islands, the harder they would fight, even though they should have surrendered. So we were faced with the terrible dilemma that every punishing thing we could think of to do to convince them that the war was over and they had lost didn't seem to work.
In the summer of 1945, on a small flat Pacific island called Tinian, more than 1,000 miles from Japan, the 509th Airborne Group arrived with 15 special B-29 bombers, each modified to deliver a single atomic bomb. With them came a small group of scientists from Los Alamos, now dressed in uniform. They had arrived on Tinian as the U.S. was conducting the deadliest bombing campaign of the war. American planes had dropped more than 300,000 tons of bombs on Japanese cities, burning them to the ground. One of the most devastating raids of the entire Pacific War took place on the night of March the 9th, 1945. American bombers burned 16 square miles of Tokyo. More than 100,000 men, women, and children were killed.
Once you accepted strategic terror bombing, it didn't make any moral difference whether you did it with one bomb or 500.
So there was no doubt the moral step had already been taken when they firebombed Tokyo. That was the demonstration that they were committed to bombing of civilians. And if you did it with regular firebombs, then why not use nuclear bombs and do it more efficiently?
By July, nearly the only cities left unbombed in Japan were the 4 which General Groves had taken off the Air Force target list: Kokura, Niigata, Nagasaki, and Hiroshima. General Groves wanted virgin targets so as to measure the true destructive power of the bomb. In Chicago, the man who'd done more than anyone else to launch the bomb project had not yet given up his struggle to stop it from being used against civilian targets. Leo Szilard organized a petition from his fellow scientists.
To Truman, he was arguing that the bomb be considered with all its moral and political implications, not just as a military weapon, and the bomb should be used in demonstration and not against actual cities.
More than 100 scientists working on the Manhattan Project signed the petition, and Szilard sent it off through official channels to President Truman. The president was still in Europe when he approved an order drafted by General Groves to use the bomb as soon as it became available. Szilard's petition never reached him. The first bomb was called Little Boy.
Early evening, we were just called and said, we're going to go tomorrow. And we went in for a briefing, just sat there sort of wide-eyed listening to the operations officer saying what we were going to do. I remember one thing he said, if you have problems, we have submarines here, here, and here to pick you up.
Harold Agnew, then 24, and 2 other scientists flew in an escort bomber on the Hiroshima mission. The bomb was on board the Enola Gay, flown by Colonel Paul Tibbets. On August the 6th at 2:45 in the morning, 3 B-29s took off from Tinian and headed for Hiroshima. It was only 3 weeks since the first atomic bomb had been tested in New Mexico. In the port city of Hiroshima, population 300,000, it was a warm, clear morning. A few people noticed the 3 silver planes that appeared overhead at 8:15 in the morning, but no one took cover. Agnew took these pictures from the window of his B-29, 25,000 feet above Hiroshima.
I was at Los Alamos when the news came of Hiroshima. I think we all were happy because we thought this would end the war. And then a few days later, we got the photographs. It was so much worse than I had expected. We had calculated how far buildings would be destroyed, but it was so much worse to actually see it.
Of course, there was a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of feeling that, we've succeeded, we're making a real impact. The efforts are not for naught. But there are a lot of misgivings, of course, at that time when you find out what you've really done.
I had no particular reaction. It did what it had been, what it was supposed to do, and I hoped the Japanese would give up immediately. One was enough. I was not happy with Nagasaki. I thought that was unnecessary.
The second bomb was called Fat Man. In Hiroshima, 75,000 people had been killed instantly. In the next 5 years, 125,000 others would die as a result of the bomb. The bomb on Nagasaki killed another 100,000. Five days later, the Japanese surrendered.